Hello, gang. Welcome back to JD Videography. Today, I want to talk about an aspect of my youth that has had a rather positive effect on my mood. So, way back, my family was heavy into board games, even to the point that we had a board game night. Early on, the board games were basic and easy to understand. Sorry, Double Trouble, Parcheesi, Chinese Checkers, Scrabble, Monopoly, and many others, especially Monopoly. We played that game so often, and I always invariably lost. It was the only board game my younger brother could win, and he had to win, otherwise, there would be a riot. But it's okay because I don't mind losing. That's something I am very good at. And we sometimes played cards as well. And this continued from the time I was about 6 years old until I was about 10. These were good times, but as I grew older, they slowly lost their charm. Especially losing all the time was kind of wearing out its novelty. And I should also point out that my older brother was more or less a teenager by this time, and while he played with us early on as a full family, he started playing with us less and less as he grew older, preferring to spend his Saturday evenings with his friends. So that's the backstory of this episode's plot. In 1990, when I was about 10 and watching Saturday morning cartoons, my father brought home this new game, HeroQuest. The game is advertised as a fantasy role playing board game, but at that time I didn't even know what role playing was. Certainly, I wasn't well versed in Dungeons and Dragons. It would be another year before I became immersed in role playing with Final Fantasy II and Link to the Past. The closest I had seen of role playing at that point was Wizards and Warriors for the NES, which I liked. In fact, HeroQuest was my gateway into the much larger world of role playing games. So we all started up a game. My father took up the role of Zargon, the dungeon master. He played the role so masterfully that I guess it was just chosen for him specifically. I chose the wizard and his respective magic card set. My younger brother, who was about 6 or 7 at the time, chose the elf. My older brother, who was 14 at the time, chose the dwarf. And my mother was the barbarian. And I should point out that my mother was cooking our breakfast at the time, so she really wasn't devoted to the game. Basically, she rolled the dice and my father moved her, and that was her entire role, just rolling the dice. Now, of course, I had no idea what I was doing. And I thought the players just kind of went off and did their own thing, so I kind of just did my own thing. So while the other three were off exploring one of the smaller rooms, I went and checked out the main room. I thought to myself, I am the wizard. No one can touch me. And there in the room lay the boss of the quest. I took a few pot shots at the boss, but the dice were not in my favor. I turned to run, but was thwarted by a bad dice roll. The boss quickly caught up with me, and I was slaughtered. Now, I'm no stranger to losing. It's kind of my thing. So I was cool to be out of the game so quickly. The others, not so much. While they went strategizing and such, the boss caught up with the rest of the team, and they were quickly picked off. And we lost. It was the first quest, and I caused the team to lose. So a week later, we had another chance to retry the experience. And once again, we had the option to choose our characters. But this time, I decided to try my hand at Zargon. My father assumed the role of barbarian, and my mother chose the wizard. More like the character was chosen by default. My brothers chose their respective characters. And this became our basic setup. And I should note that I was not a good Zargon. Maybe I wasn't very entertaining. I became so wrapped up in the narrative that I forgot to set traps. So the heroes were just gallivanting about, and I was watching the show. It took me time to learn the layout, and I often set things up incorrectly. The furniture and monsters and doors were placed incorrectly. And well, long story short, The heroes ended up winning their first quest. Then a few weeks passed and we had another round, and that would be the last time my mother would play. She was not interested in playing an hours long board game. And my older brother, who was very much a teenager at that point, had better things to do, though he would occasionally join a game or two. And thus began the three-person routine. So shortly thereafter, my father moved into the city and we took the game to his place. But it was no longer an every weekend routine. It was more a special treat that we had every other weekend. Sometimes the games would go fast and we could squeeze in two in a weekend. Sometimes they would play long and it would cut into the time of other activities. And we continued thus for about 5 years. We finished the base game and my father bought two expansion packs, Keller's Keep and The Return of the Witch Lord, and I was absolutely fascinated by the narratives these games followed. By the time I was 14, I began writing my own fantasy adventures and decided to incorporate that into the HeroQuest game. When I was about 15 years old, we finished the two expansion packs and had run out of games to play. Well, we had other such games as well. There was a Jurassic Park game based on the movie that had just released at the time. There was another HeroQuest-esque game called Black Citadel that we played for several months. There was even a game with a roll-out game board that take up the entire living room. But none of these games really caught on, so I decided to revive HeroQuest. One thing that was included in the game was a blank map and icons that represented the various monsters, furniture, and traps. And I was no stranger to this feature, as I created several of my own maps already by this point. But as a fantasy writer and immersed into role playing with Final Fantasy IV, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy VI on the way, I tried my hand at my own quest set. In fact, after the first two expansions, I didn't know there would be others. Keep in mind, I was new to the internet at the time and didn't use it to find such information. I figured the game developers just shelved the game indefinitely. So I made two of my own quest packs. The first, which I called The Dragon Isles, was a short 12 episode stint that explored a new area referred to as the Dragon Isles, each island home to its own element and ruled by its own dragon. Of course, I needed to invent new magics and new artifacts as well, and it became more of a complete redesign of the classic board game. I focused more on the narrative than the gameplay, and in fact, most of the levels were 2 or more hours long too, as a result. Pity it was before the time of 3D printing, as each dragon boss could only be represented by a Chaos Warlock or the Gargoyle playing pieces. The second quest pack, which I called The New Lands, was a twice as long 24 episode set with its own monsters and secrets. Some of the levels had multiple exits, meaning the quest could be played in different orders. There were even levels where I placed the four heroes in different starting points and they had to work alone until they could find ways to come together, all culminating in a 4 to 6 hour final episode that made use of the full game board in every piece of furniture and equipment I could get. Bookcases swung and altars pulled out to reveal new secrets. I made use of the rotating room and the Hands of Chaos from the expansion packs, and all this continued until I was 21 or 22. Of course, by that point, both my father and younger brother were sick and tired of the routine board game, especially the levels that took hours to play. They would much rather watch TV or play a card game. But I forced them to stick with it to the very end. Of course, when I was in my 20s, I was in college and no longer had time to design my own hours long levels of a now 10-year-old board game. So I let it finally rest. So, what does HeroQuest mean to me? Well, it allowed me to break up the monotony of an otherwise mundane existence. Starting while I was still in primary school, assuming a new role when I was in middle school, to allowing my creativity to shine while I was in high school. Suffice to say that the game came at a very formative time in my life. It allowed me to escape from reality, take a role, break free of a group, and become a leader. It helped cope with, or possibly led to, a more secluded lifestyle devoid of friendships. And without a doubt, it inspired my creativity to create narratives that would eventually lead to my fantasy novel compendium. Granted, I absolutely sucked at playing the bad guy and made several mistakes along the way, realizing I would make a terrible dungeon master and further alienating myself from my family. But none of that mattered because I was having fun at the time, escaping into my self made fantasy world to get away from the horror that was my everyday existence. So, what happened to the game? I honestly don't know. We stopped playing when I was 22. About 10 years later, my father passed and I moved to China. I don't know what became of his possessions, but it seems like everything else in my past, they too were scattered into the four winds, and my narratives will be lost to time eternal. So, what do you think of my exploration of this topic? Feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and if opportunity presents itself, contribute to my Patreon so I can continue to provide quality content. Until next time.